Hello, welcome to my YouTube sprint update for the fourth sprint. First, I'm going to talk about the division of work between our group members. Next, I'm going to demonstrate our app. Third, I'm going to review the GitHub, my check-ins, and my commit code. And then finally, I'm going to go onto our team Gantt and talk about the last tasks that I completed in the last sprint and the tasks that I want to complete in this sprint. So for our division of work, I chose to work on the calendar screen and the pod management screen with Isaiah. We decided to split up tasks as screens this time. I'll go ahead and demonstrate our app. I actually don't need to sign up. Go ahead and sign in. So you'll notice there's a new look to our calendar screen. We now have a pods button up on the top right for creating new meal pods. It's not implemented yet, but we do have some basic information that's hard-coded. But we do have a couple of new buttons here. First of all, we can click each of these bars represents a meal pod that we are part of, whether we're admins or we're members to it. I can go ahead and click on the title, and it's pretty similar to the last screen you just saw, but this is not hard-coded. Actually, I can tap into each one of these, and it will display the unique information that is read from Firestore for each of these unique meal pods. You'll notice that each of these are the plans inside of the pod, and they are also read from Firestore. Clicking into them would take us to a plan detail screen that's not implemented yet. But it does show the date and the time that they take place. We also added these plus buttons here, which basically allow us to, add a new meal plan to that meal pod. So yeah, a lot of functionality added since the last sprint. Now I'll go ahead and talk about some of the code on GitHub. And there's a lot, so I'm going to try to be concise. I have a total of, 6 commits to the GitHub before the end of the sprint. So my last one was on February 26th, all before the end of sprint 4. And I'm just going to go through each one starting from the bottom. So implemented Firestore reading with class components in calendar.js. Basically what a class component is you can write a component in two different ways. You can write it as a function, which that's how it was done originally, or you can write it as a class, which React Native sees in the exact same way, only with a lot of different syntax involved. And the reason why I chose to do it this way is because there's a lot of examples of Firestore usage in React Native with the usage of class components. I might be more confident to implement it with function components in the future, but this was just to get me started. My code starts down here in the component did mount function. Yes, right here. So this is where I start reading from Firestore. So once my app renders for the first time, this is called. And what I want to do is I want to get the admin associations and the member associations to a meal pod from the user. So the user can be an admin or a member of meal pods. I'll talk about one of them since they both do pretty much the same thing. Based on the current users, let me see here. Based on the current users, here we go. Based on the current user's ID, we query a member object or member objects based on by basically comparing it to the user ID field of the member. It will return an array of member objects, and what we want to do is we don't care so much about the member object itself. We care about the meal pod ID that's contained in it. We add that meal pod ID to a meal pod IDs array, and we pass that into this function right here, where we'll actually get the mealpod objects that we'll need to read from. This takes that mealpod IDs array. We create a mealpods object array here because we want to use those IDs to get the actual object. For every ID that's in the array, we want to query, or we want to read from Firestore a mealpod object based on its ID. So we'll pass that into the .doc function. It'll get the object, and what we'll go ahead and do is we'll add that to the mealpods objects array, and then we'll set the state. And the reason why we set the state is because we are displaying information now based on the state's mealpod or mealpods array. It used to be based on the test data. So you'll notice that I'll have removed that. We're no longer using the test data to display information, but now we are using the state's mealpods array. The next sprint is pretty simple. Flat lists have a key extractor, or flat lists it likes its objects to be unique in the list, so it wants a way to identify them. So this was just a quick fix to an error that I was getting. I wasn't choosing a unique key extractor for the flat list. But here we go. Added a meal plan button. Adding meal plan buttons for every mealpod container. This was so I no longer needed the test data for test meal pods, so I repurposed it to create some test meal plans here. This is where I started adding complexity to the calendar and adding those unique shapes and lists to the calendar. And basically the render button is no longer just the touchable opacity. It's now a couple of nested views with its own organization and its own flat list as well inside of it. So not only do I have a flat list of render pod buttons, I'm now making a flat list of plan buttons because each mealpod has multiple plans inside of it. And I had to learn a lot of styling as a result because of the complexity of what I was trying to accomplish with this screen. Implemented passing in the mealpod object data to the pod management screen. So when you click into the pod and you tap on the title or the header of the pod, it takes you to the management screen, and it displays unique information based on the one that you tap on. The way that I have to do that is I have to pass in the mealpod object that I got from Firestore. Flat lists like to allow us to pass in that object into our render item, and that's what this basically is. I wanted to take that item and pass it into our handle press function. And the handle press function is where we actually navigate to the screens. So in our navigate function, the first argument, let me see, is basically what screen do we want to navigate to next. But the second argument is what's known as the route or the routes, which is basically any additional data that you want the next screen to have or know. In which case, we want it to know the mealpod object itself. That way it knows which data that it's dealing with. So no longer is that hard-coded. It's actually accessed from, so if we specify this route parameter here for our pod management edit pod screen, we can access that item by saying route.params.item. And you'll notice that again, I changed a lot of these hard-coded scenarios into actual implemented, using the actual Firestore data. Second to last, adding calendar styling and navigation. For this, basically, I wanted each of the new buttons. I made a lot of new buttons. I wanted each of them to navigate to at least a desired screen that some of my teammates were working on, and this way they'd be able to test their screens and have the data that they need to I'm blanking out, work with in order to finish their job, I guess. And then finally, implementing reading meal plans from Firestore and displaying them. This was probably one of my toughest challenges because I had to get the meal plans as like its own step from getting meal pods. So I had to somehow link the meal plans to the meal pods, and one way I found out how to do that was using the index of the separate arrays. My problem was that meal pods, if I had an array of meal pods, it's just one object for every index, for every entry. But meal pods have multiple plans inside of them. So what I had to do is I had to create an array of meal plan arrays, or meal plan ID arrays, where basically each entry of that represents the meal plans that are inside of the meal pod of that same array, or of that same array index. So if I had meal pod 1 was in index 0, then the meal plans of meal pod 1 would be in index 0 of the meal plan array. That's really confusing, but anyways, I had to change a couple of my methodologies. Like for one, I had to change getting the admin associations and the member associations and putting them in one function, because they were in two separate ones beforehand. Next, while I was getting the meal pod objects, I can push the IDs. Every meal pod has an array of meal plan IDs. I would push that array to an entry of meal plan ID arrays. And what I'd basically do is I'd pass that in once that's made. I pass that into the get meal plans from IDs function, and I have to use two loops because it's an array of arrays. And query each meal plan object based on the ID that's inside. In a nutshell, basically. And then instead of using the test data, I can then again pass in the state instead of the test data, and the index is what binds them basically. And then this right here was just a quick and dirty way to display the date and time on each of those meal plan buttons. So I'll go ahead and talk about Team Gantt. So that was a lot. And I'll prove it to you. So I have a total of, I think, 16 hours alone on just the calendar screen, and then an additional 2 hours for the pod management screen. On the timesheet, it looks like this. So 5 hours on the first week, and then 13 hours on the second week. I don't know where the that's definitely 16 hours at least. That's crazy. So for the next sprint, so this is the calendar design, Firestore backend, and some of the pod management that I worked on. Next screen, I want to focus on the member permissions. I think that's the logical next step when it comes to regarding the pod management and the calendar screen, because certain permissions should change how users interact with meal pods. And since those are relevant to screens that I've worked with already, I think, and this is also, I think, one of our most important parts of the MVP, as opposed to like the messaging and stuff. So yeah. So I talked about our division of work, demonstrated our application, discussed my check-ins and commit code on GitHub, and finally I talked about my team Gantt tasks, what I did, and what I plan to do over these next 3 weeks. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in class.